The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley, Chapter 7, Radio Once More. So Arkilu, the furry beauty, planned to marry Miles Chabad, the Earthman, he who had already loved and was wed to Lilla of the Cupia. A happy prospect indeed, yet he dare not repulse the Varakinen lady, lest thereby he would lose his chance of returning to his home and his family. For at last he had formulated a plan of action, namely to arm the hordes of Varakina, lead them against the ant-men, seize an ant-plane, and with it fly back to Cupia. So for the present he appeared to fall in with the matrimonial whims of the princess. Early the next morning, however, he was prowling around inside the tent, testing his weak legs, and he overheard a conversation on the outside which changed the situation considerably. "But, father," remonstrated a voice which Miles recognized as that of Arkilu, "I found him, and therefore he is mine. I want him. He is beautiful." "Beautiful? Humph!" a stern male voice sarcastically replied. "He must be, without any fur. Oh, to think that my royal daughter would wish to wed a freak of nature, and a common soldier at that." "He's not a common soldier," asserted the voice of Arkilu. "He wears clothes merely so as to preserve his health for my sake." "Well, a sickly cripple, then," answered her father's voice, "which is just as bad. At all events, Judd is the leader of this expedition, and therefore this captive belongs to him. You can only have them only when Judd wills. It is the law." Miles Cabot stealthily crossed the tent and put an eye to the opening between the curtains at the tent. There stood the familiar figure of Arkilu, and confronting her was a massive male Varaking. His fur, however, was snow white, so that his general appearance resembled that of a polar bear. His face was apparently harsh and cold. Was appropriately harsh and cold. This was Theof the Grim, ruler of the Varakings. This dispute continued, and then there approached another man of the species. The newcomer, Blackford, was short, squat, and gnarled, yet possessed of unquestionable intelligence and a certain dignity, which clearly indicated he was of noble rank. He wore a leather helmet and carried a wooden lance. Theophthegrim hailed him with, "Ho, Judd, what brings you here?" Judd raised his spear diagonally across his chest as a salute, and replied, "A change of plans, Excellency. Upon reaching the river, I decided that it would be wiser not to return to Varenkingi by that route." "Really meaning," Arkilu interposed, with a laugh, "that you found it impossible to throw a bridge across at the point." "Why do you always doubt the reasons for my actions?" Judd asked in an aggrieved tone. "You wrong me," she replied. "I never doubt your reasons. Your reasons are always of the best. What I doubt are your excuses." "Enough, enough!" the king shouted, "for I wish to discuss more immediate matters than nice distinctions of language. Judd's reasons, or excuses, or whatever, are good enough for me. Judd, I wish to inform you that my daughter has recently captured a strange, furless being, whom it is my pleasure to turn over to you. I have not yet seen this oddity." "Father, please!" Arkilu begged, but at this junction Miles, exasperated by Theos' remarks, parted the tent curtains and stepped out. "Look well, O king!" he shouted. "Here stands Miles Cabot, the Manorian, beast from another world, freak of nature, sickly cripple, oh, common soldier, and all that. Look well, O king!" "A bit loud-mouthed, I should say," Theophthegrim sniffed, not one whit abashed. "Watch him crumble at the presence of a real man," added Judd, the excuse-maker. Suiting the action to word, the latter stepped over to Miles and suddenly slapped him on the face. As a boy, the Earthman had often seen larger boys point to their cheek or shoulder with the words, "There's an electric button there, touch it and something will fly out and hit you." But never as a boy had he dared to press the magic button, for he could well imagine the result. Such a result now occurred to Judd, for the instant his fingers touched Cabot's cheek, out flew Cabot's clenched fist to smack the joint of Judd's jaw, and tumbled him in the dust. Judd picked himself up, snarling, shook himself, then rushed bull-like at the Earthman, who stood his ground, ducked the flying arms of his antagonist, and tucked him in the old football days at college. Judd was thrown 4 yard loss, with much of the breath knocked out of his body. Theof the Grim, with a worried frown, and Arkilu the Beautiful, with an entranced smile, stood by and watched the contest. The Ver King noble lay motionless on his back as Miles scrambled to his knees astride the other's body and placed his hands on the other's shoulders. But suddenly the underdog threw up his left leg, caught Miles in the right shoulder, and pushed him backward. In an instant both men were on their feet again, glaring at each other. Then they clinched and went down once more, this time with Judd on top. Theoph's look changed to a smile, and Arkilu became worried. But before Judd had time to follow up the advantage, Chabad secured a hamlock around his neck and shoulders, and then slowly forced him to one side until their positions were reversed, and the shoulders and hips of the furry one were squarely touching the ground. In a wrestling match, this would have constituted a victory for Miles Chabad, but this was a fight and not a mere wrestling match, so the Earthman secured a hammerlock again and turned Judd and the excuse-maker over until he lay prone, whereupon the victor rubbed the nose of the vanquished back and forth in the dirt until he heard a muffled sound which he took to be the Varan King equivalent of the no more to be familiar to every pugnacious American schoolboy. His honor satisfied, Chabad arose, brushed himself off, and bowed to the two spectators. Judd sheepishly got to his feet as well, all the fight knocked out of him. Theoph stared at the victor with displeasure, and at his own countryman with disgust, but Arkilu rushed over to Chabad with a little cry, flung her arms around him, and drew him within the tent. As they passed through the curtains, Miles heard Judd the excuse-maker explaining to the king, "I decided to let him beat me, so as that thereby I might give pleasure to her whom I love." Inside the tent, Arkilu bathed the scratches and bruises on the Earthman and hovered around him and fussed over him, as though he had accomplished something much more wonderful than merely to have come out on top in a schoolboy rough-and-tumble fight. Miles was very sorry it all had happened. In the first place, he had lost his temper, which was to his discredit. In the second place, he had made a hero of himself in the eyes of a lady whose love he most anxiously was trying to avoid. And in the third place, he had fought the man who was best calculated to protect him from the undesired love. Altogether, he had made a mess of things, and all he could do about it was meekly submit to the ministrations of a furry princess. What a life! Finally, Arkilu departed, leaving Chabad alone with the recriminations of his rashness, longings for his own Princess Lilla, and worries for her safety. The next day the expedition took up its delayed start homeward, Judd having found a route which required no alibis. The tents were struck and were piled with the other impedimenta on two-wheeled carts which the common soldiers pulled with long ropes. In spite of Arkilu's pleadings, Miles was assigned to one of these gangs, Theoph grimly remarking, "If the hairless one is well enough to vanquish Judd, he is well enough to do his own share of work." Judd explained to Arkilu that the real reason why he suggested this was that he sincerely believed that exercise is good for people's health. During one of the halts, when Judd happened to be near Chabad's gang, the Earthman strode over to the commander, who instinctively cringed at his approach. "I'm not fighting today," Miles assured the Vera King with an encouraging smile, "but may I have a word with you?" So the two withdrew a short distance out of earshot from the rest, and Miles continued, "I do not love Arkilu the Beautiful. You do. Let us understand one another and help one another. You assist me to keep away from the princess, and I shall assist you by keeping away from the princess. Later, I shall make further suggestions as to how we can cooperate to mutual advantage. I've spoken." Judd stared at him with a perplexed admiration. "Who are you?" he asked. "Who stands unabashed in the presence of kings and nobles, who addresses a superior without permission, and yet without offensive familiarity?" "I am Chabad the Minorian," the other replied, "ruler over Cupia, a nation larger and more powerful than yours. A race of fearsome beasts have landed on the western shores of your continent. They are enemies of mine and will become enemies of yours as they extend their civilization and run counter to yours." "Impossible!" Judd exclaimed, "for how could these mythical creatures cross the boiling seas to land on the shores?" "By magic," answered Miles. "Magics which they have stolen from me, and they have held me prisoner until I overthrew their magic and escaped, to be found by your expedition. Then you are a magician?" "Yes." "Ah, that explains how you defeated me in combat yesterday," Judd asserted with a relieved sigh. "We will let it go at that," Miles agreed, smiling. "But to continue, let me frankly warn you that unless you destroy the Formians, they will eventually destroy you. They now possess magic against which you, the Ver Kings, would be powerless. Magic methods of soundless speech, magic devices for transmitting that speech as far as from here to Ver Kingi, magic weapons that can travel through air and at such a speed that they could go from here to Verkingi and back in a 12th part of a day, and magic bows that shoot death-dealing pellets faster than the speed of sound, and which can outrange your bows and arrows 10 to 1. But if you will give me a workroom and materials and keep Arkilu away from me, I will devise magic that can overcome their magic, and which will make the Verkingi the unquestioned masters of this whole continent, in spite of the Roys and the Formians. Then I shall seize one of the Formian magic weapons, fly it back to my own country, and leave you in peaceful dominion over this continent. What do you say to that? I say, the Ver King replied, that you are an amusing fellow and an able spinner of yarns, but you talk with evident earnestness and sincerity. Therefore I shall give you a workshop and materials, but on one condition, namely, that you entertain us likewise. I have spoken. And thus it came to pass that Judd the excuse-maker attached the Earthman to his personal retinue and placed a laboratory at his disposal upon the return of the arrival of the expedition at Verkingi. This city was built entirely of wood. It was surmounted by a high stockade, and was divided by stockades into sections, each presided over by a noble, save only the central section, which was housing to the retinue of Theof himself. Within the sections, each family had its own walled-off enclosure. All the streets and alleys passed between the high wooded walls. The buildings and fences were carved and gaudily colored. As the returning expedition approached the great wall, they were met by blasts of trumpets, music from the parapets. Then a huge gate opened, and they passed inside. Here they quickly separated. Each detachment hastened to a quarter of the noblemen from whom they had been drawn. Judd and his detachment proceeded down many high-walled streets until they came to a gate bearing the insignia of Judd himself. Inside there were more streets of the same character, through which Judd's retinue dispersed into the gates of their own little enclosures until Judd and Miles Chabad were left alone. The noble left his new acquisition to a gate. This enclosure is vacant, Judd explained. It will be yours. Enter and take possession. Within you will find a small house and a shop. Serving maids will be sent from my own household to make sure that you are comfortable. Repair to my palace tonight and tell me more stories. Meanwhile, goodbye for the present. And he strode off and disappeared around a bend in the street. Chabad passed in through the gate. He found a well from which he drew water to fill a carefully fashioned wooden pool. Scarce had he finished bathing when a group of furry girls arrived from the house of his patron bearing brooms and blankets and food. One of them also bore a note which read as follows: "If you love me, you will find a way to reach me, Arkilu." "And if not, what?" said Miles to himself. After he rested and dined, and the place had been more thoroughly neatened, all the girls withdrew save the one who had brought the note. She informed him that her name was Quitman, and that she had been ordered to remain in the enclosure as his servant. She was small and light. Her hair was a brilliant yellow gold, and her eyes were blue. If it had not been for her fur, she would have passed for a twin to his own Lilla. This fact brought an intense pang to him, and caused such a wave of homesickness that he sat down on a couch and hid his face into his hands. But the pretty creature made no attempt to comfort him. Instead, she merely remarked, half aloud to herself, "I wonder what Arkilu can possibly see in him. Even at the terrible is much more handsome." Finally, Miles arose with more determination and courage than he had felt at any time since his return to Poros. Guided by Quitman, he set out for Judd's dwelling, firmly resolved to take steps that very night which should result eventually in his reaching Cupia and rescuing his family from the renegade Yuri. Judd's palace was elaborate and barbaric. Judd himself was seated on a divan, surrounded by King and beauties. They were all frankly inquisitive to see this hairless creature from another world, yet they rather turned up their pretty noses at him when they found him dressed like a common soldier. Chabad regaled the gathering with an account of his first arrival on Poros, and of the 2 wars of liberation which had freed Cupia from the domination of the ants. All the while he was most eager to get down to business with the noble, yet he realized that he had been employed for a definite purpose, namely storytelling, and that his first duty was to please his patron. Finally the ladies withdrew, and Miles Chabad, the radio man, began his first discussion of radio that he had undertaken since his return to Poros.